Hi, I'm Neville J. McKenzie, and this is the asiatechpodcast. And today we have a very special guest. The guest is none other than Graham Brown.
Yeah.
So, Graham, can you just introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Neville. First time I sat on the other side of the table. My name's Graham Brown. I am the host of Asiatech Podcast, not the Asiatech Podcast, for the record. So I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe it's a different one. That's who I am. So that's my introduction.
So how did you get into podcasting?
It's been a while. I did my first, I think I did like a radio style interview. I think it was podcasting going back like 2002, 2003 by Skype. First ever, in the old days when you stuck like a box into the phone. You know, those days when if you did like a telephone interview, you had to run like a separate line at the phone, like a microphone jack.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, you're too young. Yeah. So I did that, and the first ever guy I interviewed, because I was in telecoms at the time, was the guy who later went on to start Angry Birds. At the time, he was working for Hewlett-Packard. So that was my first ever interview. But I really enjoyed interviewing people, and off and on, I'd started and stopped podcasts in different areas. You know, I got into property investment, telecoms, marketing, and so I've always had it there in the background, but I've never made it into a business, and that was, you know, the latest stage in my journey, which is Asiatech Podcast.
So you mentioned telecom. What else did you mention?
Marketing,
and property.
Yeah,
they're all very different.
Yeah.
So why did you switch from one thing to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think it only makes sense in Steve Jobs style when you're looking back and joining the dots. Like there was a master plan.
Yeah.
And you're always trying to, I mean, we always do these things and how does this all fit together? I just want to do one thing. I want to be that guy who just bakes cakes and talks about cakes and writes books about cakes, but life is never that simple, is it? And I always thought, like, why am I in telecoms and property, real estate? And I mean, when I thought about it I asked somebody at the time, what are the two things that you leave the house with? And they said, my house keys and my mobile phone. Okay, well, that makes sense to me. That made sense to me because they were like essentials. Mobile phone, real estate. But, you know, even back in the day, people said, you know, I left with my wallet. You don't even need that these days. So you don't need, in something, you go to China, you don't need a wallet or a credit card. So the only things that people really need are the house keys and a phone, and not even a car keys anymore, right?
Yeah.
Those are gone. So these are like essentials of what we need in a day-to-day life. So I think they're great to build a business around, and they touch everybody's lives. So, you know, we're not talking about blockchain, where it's very specific and technical and engineering focused. We're talking about people. Because if you talk about mobile phones, everybody you know has got a mobile phone pretty much.
Yeah.
And of a certain age. And it touches everybody's lives. So once you remove the technology, what's left is just the people. The commonality is that people part, which is really what I'm passionate about.
People.
So, people. So I would gravitate towards businesses which were about people rather than blockchain or, you know, something technical. And that's essentially what those businesses were at the end of the day.
So where were you? Where was your business career? Where did it start? What country? UK. So you had property in UK, telecom business in UK. Then what did you do?
Not in that order. I was in Japan in the 90s. Came back from Japan. Absolutely certain I was going to start my own business. Didn't know how the hell to start. I had no experience whatsoever. Nobody I knew in my network was an entrepreneur. None of my family. Because the only kind of entrepreneurs we knew back then when I was starting out were self-employed people like plumbers, which is not really like startup people, or educated people like, you know, teachers. That was it. That was very sort of, you know, I suppose it's working class professionals in a way, or lower middle class maybe, if you class it like that. So there was no entrepreneurs. There was nobody who I could turn to, like uncle, whatever, who'd built a business and said, Graham, this is what you need to do. But I absolutely knew I was going to do this and wanted to do it. So I didn't know what to do. I remember opening the newspaper, seeing an ad in the newspaper saying, you can own your own business and earn, I think, like £35,000 a year. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to do this. And there's just like a phone number. It didn't say what it was, but I was so hungry that I just phoned it up and they said, yep, you can start your own business. Come in to our offices at this time for a presentation.
But usually when I see those adverts, I immediately dismiss them. Why did you?
I was naive.
So what was the business?
So it was a financial company, financial services sales company. It was Boiler Room, if you've ever seen the movie, you know, like 120 calls a day. And you went in there, but I loved it. This is amazing. Like, I'm selling and I'm making money. I didn't know how to sell. They taught me how to sell. I learned so much about financial products and services. And really, it wasn't my own business. I was just self-employed for the tax reasons. So they didn't have to pay, you know, like employer contributions. But I learned so much, and it really made me, even though I had to get out. It was really tough environment. And I remember they said, you know, at the interview, I was asking about what it was like to be self-employed. They said, it's amazing. It's like, you can come in at any time you want in the morning, as long as it's before 8 o'clock.
Yeah. So what were the 3 most important lessons that you learned working there?
That it's all about sales. At the end of the day, everything is sales. So I learned all about that. And I learned about, for the first time, somebody had showed me that I could improve my life. And I know it sounds like really trite, but I learned that because my boss, one day he just sat around and said, oh yeah, have you ever read this book? And I said, what is it? And he goes, Tony Robbins. I'm like, no, never heard of him. No, nobody I knew around me consumed that kind of crap. Oh, it's like self-help. Like, they didn't touch that stuff. But I opened it and I thought, oh, wow, this guy's like saying really interesting stuff. So I learned all about that. I learned that you could actually improve your life and become better.
So why weren't the people around you reading that kind of stuff?
I don't know. It just wasn't done. They were like, you know, teachers and engineers. And
when you told them you were reading this kind of stuff, what was their reaction to it?
That I was somehow getting into a cult.
A cult?
Yeah. Because when I first started reading it was like, you know, this is amazing. You can do this, and you can change your mindset, and you can improve your life, and you can be, you know, all these all these kind of things. And they were like, ooh. Like,
did you find that disheartening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was like completely fired up about this,
and then how did you overcome that disheartenment?
Well, it's like a big dissonance, isn't it? Like this is what you want to do. Everybody else you ever knew is like not against it, but that sort of silence is probably as bad. You know, where they don't, you know, like you tell them something amazing and they're just like, oh, I hear so and so is getting married. It's like whatever you say. It's like, did you, you know, how are West Ham getting on? It's like they try and deflect it back to normal, boring conversation. Maybe because I don't know, they don't know how to deal with it. Feel a bit threatened by it, and especially like the manner in which I was approaching it was quite ballsy and like bravado and big, and so I think it probably annoyed a lot of people, especially people that are, you know, I grew up with, people I went to college with. You know, they just thought I was an idiot.
So now, when you meet people like those, because they're still around, how do you react to them?
Talk about West Ham or
you tell, because you know, you come across as quite a driven person. Yeah. So you meet somebody that you're saying that this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go.
Yeah.
And then they sort of give you that sort of passive, well, it's not really me reaction. What do you do?
What if they do that to me?
Yeah, now.
Then I just walk away.
Yeah.
I don't need them.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned you're in Japan. Why did you go to Japan? Because it's not something people normally do in the 90s.
Well, in the 90s they did. Oh, well, if you were of a certain type of person, that wanted to go and see the world and was ambitious and curious, you would have gone to Japan, because China wasn't a thing. There were no other options, really. It was the big market. And if you sort of grew up in the 80s, as I did, Japan was like the thing. And put it into context, you know, there's all those stories about the bubble economy in Japan. It was just like money upon money upon money. And you look at the data of Japan. I mean, I only know this now, but this is what I grew up with, and I grew up with the stories. But there were times when the Japanese economy was growing, like, and you know, an economy these days, 3% growth a year is big. 4 or 5 if you're Singapore, right? China, 6 or 7. But there were years when Japan was growing like 30, 40, 50% a year. I mean, it's phenomenal, right? And then into the 80s, it was growing like in double digits, like 12, 15%. It was just massive. It was growing. It was taking over the world. You know, I grew up with Sony and Panasonic and TDK, and, you know, if you were into music, they were all made by Japanese companies, and you had a stereo at home which was Japanese, and you watched it on a Japanese TV, and you know, we learned about Japanese cars and like samurai and ninja, and wow, this world just blew me away, and I wanted to be a part of that. And I looked at where I grew up and just wanted to get out.
And so you went to Japan. So what did you do in Japan?
Well, it wasn't part of the plan. I graduated with AI, artificial intelligence degree, and because I believed it was the future, but I was like 20 years too early. Like, nobody knew what the hell artificial intelligence was in 1994, 5. So when I graduated, I went to the careers office, and they sat me down with like the ring-bound folders, and he just looked at me like, what have I just wasted my 3 years on? And he just said, why didn't you go and teach in Japan?
Oh.
You know, whereas now, I mean, I'd be like, you know, Google, Uber, Facebook, line up and give me a big fat salary. But back then it was very different. So they said, go and teach English in Japan. That was the only job that I could do.
For an AI graduate, the only job was to
only
teach.
because I could speak English by virtue of the fact I was English, right? I had no other sellable skills. And just so happened, Japan was, at that time, the bubble had burst, but it was still a big economy, and it was still had yet to reconcile the fact that it wasn't a world leader, and it was going downhill. But they didn't realize it then. So in the mid-90s, they were still hiring a shit ton of English teachers. So, you know, I knew somebody that went there and said, go, it's life-changing. And I was like, that's all I needed to hear. I'm out here.
How long do you spend?
I was 2 years in Japan that time.
And then after 2 years in Japan teaching?
Yeah, I was teaching 2 years in Japan, and then I came back to the UK. I left Japan in like the late 90s, and then at that time the UK economy was really picking up, and I started hearing stories. I felt like missing out a little bit. I heard stories about how London, that people were walking out of jobs. I mean, so walking out of university and getting like really good jobs in the city. That was when the city became a thing again, right? I'm like, I want to get back into that. So I flew back straight out of Japan, and then I thought, how do I get a job in the city? I didn't know anybody, didn't know anything about stock trading, but I went up to all these interviews, and people were like, what do you know? I'm like, teaching English. And no success whatsoever. And then that job ad spoke to me, and that's how it all sort of happened.
So after the job in finance, what did you do then?
I went and started my own business. Well, I wanted to start a business, because this was like, you know, that's what I was trying to get to, start my business. And the job in the city, selling finance, was sort of a step. But I didn't know what to do. 1997, 98, people started buying computers and PCs. Like, you know, that was the first time you'd buy a PC in a business, maybe, you know, invest in a Windows PC, because Windows 97 obviously was out. And then, so me and my best mate said, let's start a business together. Let's build computers, and sell them, right? And that's what we did. So we started that. And then our marketing strategy, and I laugh now because obviously now it's all very technical and MVP and sales funnels, but our marketing strategy is, right, here's the phone book. You start on A, I'll start on M. Seriously, it would be the yellow pages, right? All right, okay, let's go. would be it. And we would pick up the phone. And I'd learnt that kind of training in City Financial, the company I work for. You know, building list, pitching. I learnt all that. So I'd pick up the phone. Hello, Mr. McKenzie. Do you have a computer? Are you interested in a computer? Blah, blah, blah. So we just go. I mean, it was soul destroying. And we'd make hundreds of calls and get like 1 or 2 meetings and maybe sell a computer. But when we actually sold a computer, it was like, yeah, high fives, we've done it. But then we had to build it.
Oh, so you didn't have a...
No.
So you were
selling them and building them.
Okay, right.
We had to we went to the, there were lots of kind of like these computer markets that would happen like Tottenham Court Road area where you'd go and you'd kind of get all the bits. And like the computer world there was very geeky.
Yeah.
So you'd go and you'd have to be like looking for a fan and looking for a power pack and stuff like that. So, I mean, you know, it's an amazing experience. I learned how to do all that from nothing.
Yeah.
And you couldn't go online and Google this stuff really. That was impossible back then. You had to buy like a dummies, you know, those books, something for dummies.
Oh, yeah. Computers for Dummies. Or,
it really was computers for dummies.
Word for Dummies. And, yeah. Right.
So that with the CD in it. So that's how we started. And then, we went into it for about a year, made a little bit of money, but then he left because he just couldn't handle it anymore.
And then you run your own?
Yeah, he went to a job.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, what do I do? I can't go back. I can't. No, I'm in now because when I left, I was like, all my friends, hey, I'm starting a business. And it wasn't a startup back then. I had no money, started a business, and by that point I was in debt. I didn't have any support. No, you couldn't go and raise money from a bank or an investor back then. So he just left me. He just walked out, and then I was left with the debt. And I didn't realise, don't worry, you're a limited company. Don't worry, you can write the debt off. And then all the debtors started chasing me and threatening to take me to court. And eventually I had to settle all the debts. I'm not sure legally whether or not I had to, because they technically said we were insolvent, which means that you can't trade whilst you're insolvent, which means you can't meet your liabilities. So you shouldn't be buying more computer stuff, right? Which I was. So I had to pay all that stuff back, and I had to have these kind of credit agreements with the debtors, the creditors, if you like, which I had to pay off over a period of, I don't know, up to 10 years. But I paid everything off. So that was my first ever business, which was a complete fucking disaster.
And what came next?
Another business. I went from, so what happened was that whilst I was doing that, there was sort of these meetups being organised. People were interested in internet back in 97, 98. When internet was AOL CDs, right? But there were people who were starting to realise actually there was kind of business here, and let's understand it. So people started organising these meetups. I started organising those, just because I knew a lot of people like from the computer parts world, or companies who are buying this stuff, and you met a lot of people in those days, just randomly. You could get onto the chat, like ICQ.
Yeah.
Do you remember ICQ?
Yeah.
I'd meet people randomly on ICQ, like some guy, and he would be, hey, how's it going? Yeah, great. What do you do? Oh, I'm doing this stuff in Sweden. Yeah, cool. I'm in London next week. Do you want to meet for a beer? Yeah. All right, let's do that. And you'd meet them. And to think that would happen today is just crazy. You met because you were interested in the internet. You could meet people. So I started organising that and gathering it together, and then people said, at the time, about 2000, a lot of people started getting interested in mobile and, WAP at the time, wireless application protocol. So in the old days when it was all black and white.
Those from Japan? Is that it's sort of like internet on your mobile phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The early days when it was 9.6K speed. Because I'd seen it in Japan and I realised this is going to happen here. And I started realising, I've seen this already in Japan. It's happening here now. People are interested in it. I started organising these sort of meetups in pubs. People then started offering sponsorship for it. And this thing started growing. And then so what happened is we started organising these events. We went from organising events in pub, and it just gathered this steam. People started joining my team. So I had at one point like 6 or 7 people in the company, in no sort of vague structure. It's a very vague structure, like who owned what, we didn't know, but we were just doing these events and making money. And suddenly we were organising events. I was going to America, and I was speaking at conferences about WAP, right? In a year, because actually our company had a similar name to another company out there, which was like, I won't go into the details because they might be listening, but there was another company out there that had a very similar name to us about WAP. They were like, WAP something, and we were WAP something else. Just bear with me. And so people started contacting. It just shows you how cottage industry it was. It's that people started contacting us, phoning up and said, are you from the WAP? And he said, yeah, that's us. Okay. We've got CNBC on the line, or we want you to speak at this conference. I was like, blimey. But we were doing these events, but we weren't those guys. So that created a lot of opportunity for us. That business grew very well. I mean, we did about 2 years out of that, made quite a bit of money at sponsorship and doing events. And then 2001, 2002, the whole .com thing blew up. And when, we went from people paying like $10,000 to $15,000 to speak, to be on a conference panel, to sponsor it, to be on that, to like the next week, nothing. Crickets. So that completely went belly up. So yeah, it was a wild ride. That was the second business.
And then the third?
The third business, I'll keep it short, but out of all of that, the third business was the most successful, and it lasted 12 years. And that was what I was really passionate about: telecoms, people, Japan. It was about young people and mobile phones. During all this time we were doing this WAP stuff, all these sort of stories about young people and mobile phones were coming out. And obviously my experience in Japan was huge in that, because they were like the first in the world, all these like young high school girls using mobile phones. So, I remember going to Nokia in like 2001, 2002 and knocking on the doors and saying, hey, I'm sort of like writing some research about young people and mobile phones. And Nokia back then said, no, we don't do kids. And it's amazing, like nobody at that time thought about young people and mobile phones. This was like pre-SMS and pre-all that taking off. But I thought this is the future. Young people, kids, mobile phones. Everybody was going, no. It's, middle-aged, boring executives. Middle-aged execs like me now. Yeah. Not 13-year-olds who are the future. I said, no, this is what it is. It's like messaging and it's sharing and all this stuff. So we created a research company. It was really successful.
Why was it successful?
Nobody else was doing it.
That's it. No one else was doing it. And did anyone follow you up on that? Did the competition start?
Yeah, people tried to copy it, but we were always writing about young people first and mobile second, which it was always, analysts were always coming from the technology angle. So and I was passionate about people, from my background about, psychology and artificial intelligence. It was all about people and modeling behavior and so on, and understanding behavior. I was fascinated about that. And, some of our first clients were people like Disney and MTV, not the mobile companies, because they got it. Yeah. They were like, oh, young people are using mobile phones now. We need to understand that. So MTV were probably one of my best clients throughout the whole, 10, 12 years. So, but that was amazing. Then I got to work with all these companies at MTV and Disney and, everybody on the base layer side, like the Intels, all the way up to, we did a big project for the European Union about young people and mobile phones. I went to the United Nations in New York.
How was that?
Yeah, it was amazing. I went to like the United Nations, that bloody great big building that you see on the TV. I went there and I presented there to the UN, not like all the delegates. But I presented to the UN about young people and mobile phones, and they published a report. There's a United Nations report. It's called I forget the name, but it's something like children and technology, something like that, like global. And I'm one of the authors. I'm contributing authors to it. So, I've gone from being a complete imposter, not knowing anything, to being the only guy in the world who knew about this subject. I wrote a book about it. I got called onto TV, speaking gigs. Brands were like calling me up. Can you speak at our company powwow? Whether they were like a drinks brand or whoever. Because there was nobody else who, I think it goes to the point, find that niche and completely own it. And whatever it is, I mean, you would never have thought that was a big market, but whatever it is, you can make a big market out of it if you're world number one in that.
So after the United Nations gig, what then?
I don't know what happened then. I think it's a successful business, made good money out of it. Somebody told me along the way that, you don't make money out of businesses. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm in this to sell my business for X million. And they told me, look, that's what you think, but it doesn't work like that. It can work like that, but in most cases it doesn't. So what I advise you to do is make as much money as possible out of your business, cash flow, rather than building a business to sell it, which is what I was trying to do. Create a lot of cash, take the cash out of the business and stick it into assets, buy real estate. And it made complete sense because, make money whilst you sleep and all that stuff. And that was the best advice I was ever given, because they got to a point where, the real estate was making more money than my day job. And then I started thinking, well, why am I doing my day job? I'm getting bored of this now. I needed a new challenge.
And so you moved you created assets in real estate.
Yeah.
That's running itself more or less.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got bored.
I think everything has a life cycle, don't you think? Don't you think? Like,
You sold the business.
I sold it to the partner I was working with.
Yeah. And then what happened?
Then, so this is 2012 with my wife, and my son was 6 at the time.
So when did they appear? At what stage?
My wife and son.
Yeah.
I just picked them up along the way. They just.
I mean, was it before?
My wife's Japanese, so I met her in Japan. She came back with me.
In Japan, yeah.
Yeah.
And how did she feel about you giving up your day job, and what was the conversation there?
Well, this is a really interesting question, Neville, because I think that is really important. That if you're going to do that, you've got to have a partner who's on board. If they don't get it, it's going to be really tough. And she got it, which is quite rare for Japanese because they're quite sort of career focused. But her dad he's passed away now, but was a really interesting character, a lovely man. He was like, he owned an antique books shop in Japan. He's selling the old scrolls, like really valuable scrolls. Some of them are actually like national treasures, which you can't take out of the country, even though they own them, right? And he used to, during the bubble period of the 80s, he would fly from Japan to New York Christie's and sell his scrolls.
Even the ones that you couldn't take out?
Yeah. I mean, some of them, obviously, some of them are national treasures, but there was, because the demand for that sort of stuff in the 80s was huge.
Yeah.
And obviously the Japanese were buying it as well, so he was doing really well. So he was living this really good life, selling these scrolls, working for himself. So, I think people who get entrepreneurship usually grow up around entrepreneurs or have seen something. It makes it a lot easier to understand. If they grow up around professionals and like doctors and lawyers and MBAs, and it's harder to understand entrepreneurship, and it's harder to then talk about that with a wife or a husband, right? So, yeah, she was on board from the start. She supported me, and which is great because, it's never a straight line. It walks up and down. So during those down periods, if she was against the idea, it could have easily been like, okay, you've had your fun. Yeah. Now it's time to get back in and earn a salary. And those conversations come up many, many times, right? So, yeah, to her credit, she stuck by me.
Okay, so you've finished with the telecoms company.
Yeah.
You've got your assets. Then what happened?
Then we said, fuck it, like, let's do something with our lives. And 2012, didn't need to start another business because, you know, I had a bit of like fuck you money, so to speak. And then didn't want to start another business because I was like, had enough of all that. And my son was sick, so it was perfect timing. So, like, he
just as it about to start school.
Yeah, he had started school.
Yeah.
So he was already, like, because in the UK he would have been a year in.
Yeah.
And he'd already done nursery, so he's done 2 years, but not old enough such that he's got mates who, you know, like they hang around with all the time. That hasn't started yet. So he thought, well, let's go and travel the world. So actually the plan originally was to move to New Zealand because that was the other side of the world.
Yeah.
So we did that, and then we got into New Zealand and thought, actually, let's keep going. So we did, and then we went like New Zealand. I think that it actually went like 3 months in New Zealand, and then we went to Fiji, Hawaii, California, which was amazing. I loved California, and then to Florida, and then we were done. We had to move on because we'd done our 60 days in the US. So you've got to get out. So we flew to Cyprus. It's a bit random. We thought, could we live here? We'd been there before, we liked it. But when we went back to look as if we were going to live there, it was very different. And then we didn't like that. So randomly, we flew back to London, and it was snowing. I remember that, at Gatwick. So, like, we're not coming back here. Landed, next day flew out again. I didn't even tell, like, my mom that we were back in the UK, because if she knew, she was like, oh, why don't you come down and visit me and stuff like that. No, like, we're getting out of here. Like, we're going from Cyprus to the Canary Islands. Landed in Fuerteventura, the Canary Islands. And then we looked at Canary Islands. We kind of liked it. And then just over the water from Fuerteventura, you can see Lanzarote. And we thought, let's just go and have a look. Like, we've traveled everywhere. We've tried everything. You know, we haven't found anywhere to live. Let's just go and look at Lanzarote. We'll take a ferry across. We took a day trip across. And I remember I took a day trip across, and like, it was just perfect that day. It was like blue skies and, you know, white houses and blue sea. And, you know, we were just kind of hanging out in cafes.
And volcanic earth.
Volcanic earth. Yeah, rocks everywhere. It was just, that was a bit exotic. Palm tree, well, a palm tree, not palm trees. And then I remember seeing a group of cyclists go past. And then it just like, okay, this is where I got to be. Because, you know, I'd done half Ironman before that. I knew there was an Ironman in Lanzarote. And I thought, oh, it all makes sense now. This is why I came here. And then I turned around to my wife and said, can we stay here? And she's like, yeah, I love it. It's Spanish. It speaks Spanish in Lanzarote, but it's, you know, quite familiar. And then so we lived there.
You learned Spanish?
Yeah.
Your wife learned Spanish?
Yeah, she did. Yeah. And my son went to Spanish school because everyone's going, like, put him into international school. I'm like, no. We send him to Spanish school. So my wife didn't speak any Spanish when she arrived. And obviously she speaks Japanese and English. My son speaks Japanese and English. And they took a bus with they had to negotiate with the bus driver. Like, he could speak any English. Took up into the hills looking for this school. There was a school up in the hill, like a really local school. And we arrived at this local school, and without any appointment, just turned up. And it was like a tiny school, just turned up. They turned up. And without speaking any Spanish, and they couldn't speak much English either, because they were like they didn't have any international kids there. And they were trying to communicate, and she basically got it across to the head that I would have put my son in your school. Didn't have any appointment. But they were like, come. And they like sit in the office and drink coffee and talk and, like, you know, show pictures of all this sort of stuff. And somehow she got Harry, my son, registered in the school, and he started a week later. I mean, how that happens is a miracle. But I think it just goes to show, you know, if you want to make things happen, they can happen.
So how long do you spend in Lanzarote?
We did just under 2 years. I did the Ironman. which was like a really big thing, a big goal. And then after that, we just kind of got a little bit bored of island life. It's only like 80,000 people there. And as you say, it's volcanic, so it's like just barren rock.
It's like living on the moon.
It is, yeah. It's like a moonscape. Yeah. Have you been there?
Yeah.
Right. Well, you know, a lot of Brits go on holiday there.
Yeah,
well, so. It's all right. I mean, it's a really nice, it's a lovely place, and I love the people.
Yeah, the weather's good.
Oh yes, year-round sunshine. It's great for. I mean, if you're into cycling or running, it's amazing.
Yeah. So we've done Lanzarote, and
how long we got?
You've got money.
Yeah.
You've got money. You can live anywhere you want. So then what? What do you do? How did you decide you were going to do? What you were going to do next?
Well, we moved. It was just completely. I don't know how it started, but we like living on islands, tropical islands. But we want something a bit more exotic. So, and Lanzarote, I remember we had an internet connection. We were paying about €100, so about, I don't know, $100 a month for internet. And we were getting like 3 megabytes. It was so frustrating. So things like that were getting kind of annoying. So we thought we'd go somewhere that was a little bit more developed, more people, more choice, you know, because we'd seen like the same cafe, the same restaurant every day for like a year or whatever. It's getting boring. So we looked around and we did all our research and ended up in Okinawa.
As an island.
So if you don't know, I mean, I don't know if you know where Okinawa is, right?
It's in Japan, and I think the winters are going to be cold.
Well, it's in Japan, you're right. Yeah. It's out in the East China Sea, or the South China Sea, sorry. So it's in between Japan and Taiwan. It's actually closer to Taiwan. So if you sort of go all the way down from Japan towards, I don't know, Thailand or Hong Kong direction, you'll eventually hit Taiwan, but before that you get to Okinawa. It's tropical, subtropical, not really cold in winter. Gets down to about 15 degrees. Okay. Yeah. But it has huge, like mega typhoons there. Like it's in the typhoon path.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's just really beautiful. And we thought we'd do that. I wanted to get Harry into a Japanese school because he obviously could speak Japanese, but he couldn't read or write. And I wanted, you know, he was fluent in English. He was like 7, 8 at the time. He speaks Spanish as well. Mm. But I wanted him to kind of like pick up on his Japanese as well. Maybe, you know, he'd never lived in Japan. So I wanted him to connect with that part of the culture as well. So we went to Okinawa, the home of karate, and amongst other things. And some of the longest living people in the world. Yeah. Yeah.
So how long did you live in Okinawa?
6 months.
6 months. Oh, okay.
Didn't work out. It didn't work out.
So did your son learn Japanese?
Yeah, he did. He went to Okinawan school. Yeah. Like really local school. Yeah. Which was really nice. It was like really familial. You know, it was not like it's bigger than the Spanish one, but they were all like really friendly, and Okinawan people are really laid back. Food's amazing there. I love it. And there's Okinawa soba, which is like I don't even like Japanese ramen or whatever, but it's like more like the tonkotsu, which is like pork ramen with like the heavy soup with like the crinkly noodles, and they have a lot of the goya, which is the bitter gourd, the green knobbly thing, which is really high in antioxidants and so on. Yeah, and the amazing sashimi, sushi, fish is amazing. It's just a really nice place. Some really, really stunning beaches as well. But
6 months.
6 months is all we gave it. Right. We couldn't find a place to live, really difficult. 2/3 of Okinawa is American bases. And that just like, you can imagine squeezing all the population into what's left. It doesn't make a great place to live. It's really beautiful as a tourist, but I think what we were realizing that actually we needed a bit more civilization. So
you needed more you need more civilization. So
we went to mainland Japan. We're not getting to the point, are we? But you did ask me, and it's a long story, Neville. Yeah. So what do you say?
So we're mainland Japan. So why mainland Japan? Why?
Well, because I love Japan. Obviously, my wife loves Japan, and wanted to get Harry into school. not an international school, but a Japanese school. And living in Japan is very, very easy, very, very comfortable. The food is amazing. It's kind of cheap to live there, I think, like compared to Singapore.
Yeah.
I know it used to be a lot more expensive. Everything works, very safe. So we wanted to do that. And we went to, so if you imagine where Tokyo is, and then you go down to Mount Fuji, which is sort of the southwest of Tokyo, we're in between, like plumber line down to the coast. The place we lived was, if anybody knows, it's called Kugunuma Kaigan. Yeah, you won't know, but maybe listeners might know. But Kugunuma Kaigan, right by Enoshima, where the big Buddha is, Daibutsu, the huge Buddha, the huge bronze Buddha. And so you can picture a place, it's like the surf capital of Japan. So there's a huge surfing community there. Like these guys who by day are corporate salaryman man, but 4 o'clock in the morning, they're out surfing waves. It's a really bizarre culture. Like they all sort of dress like Californian style, you know, long hair and the caps, and then they get in a suit and go to Tokyo. And you had a beach where you could go down. It wasn't the cleanest beach, but it looked really nice. And you go down there, everybody's surfing out there. And honestly, you could look to your right, and especially in a winter day, you see it right there, just Mount Fuji, just staring at you. And you're on a beach and you've got these blue skies, and you think, wow, this is amazing. So it really was a nice place to live. Yeah, so we did 2 years there.
Yeah. And so you have 2 years, what made you leave?
I think it was natural next step, which was bring this all the way back to Asiatech Podcast, which is that the more I got into the world of entrepreneurship and startups, the more I sort of got dragged back into it. Because when I was living in Japan, I was still kind of semi-retired. You know, I was sort of dabbling. I'd work 10 hours a week.
So what were you working
on? Side projects, like people were asking me to help them out, advisor on this, that, and the other. And I was kind of like, I was still doing stuff like my own websites, trying to put together like courses, which didn't, you know, some flew, some didn't, creating my own videos, just keeping myself busy and creating stuff. Then getting into Asiatech Podcast, like doing that, starting that, building that.
Was that from dabbling in your website, and was that sort of an evolution into podcasting, or was it just a decision you made to move into podcasting?
Well, I had a show before that called Founder FM, which was like Asiatech Podcast, but for the world, for startup founders. Because I was just, you know, I never disconnected from that community. I was always fascinated by startup founders and people and their stories and that journey. And so I started doing that, talking to amazing people. And the more and more I did it, the more I got drawn into it. Then it became about Asia, because I was doing more and more Asian stuff. Then it became Asiatech Podcast. And then I realized I really enjoy this. And I was kind of doing more and more work. And suddenly I was like working full time when it wasn't a job. And then we thought, you know, if I'm going to turn this into a business, like I have to go where the action is. And in Japan, there's no startup action. Very, very little. You know, you can't, being an entrepreneur in Japan is not the same as here or anywhere in Asia.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be surrounded by people who, you know, it goes back to that whole point. Like I left Portsmouth in England because I was surrounded by people who didn't get what I was trying to do. And that was sort of similar situation in Japan now. We're surrounded by people who are corporates and salary people. And, you know, if you were a startup, they didn't even know what a startup was. Some people knew, but 99% didn't.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly having to justify myself, and it's tiring. So I wanted to come here.
Where's here?
Singapore.
Lion
City.
So how did you make that decision that Singapore was supposed to be the place to be?
Well, it wasn't a direct line. So allow me to just allow me to embellish the story. We initially planned to go to Thailand because I was still sort of like in that I can do this and be kind of retired, semi-retired type thing mode, and run the podcast. And my family sent me as the forward scout to Thailand to check it out. So I went to Phuket. We'd already been to Phuket and we liked it. I thought we can go and live in Phuket. And I flew down to Phuket. then shortly after, a few weeks in, on my own, looking for places, I realised this isn't going to work because it's a really nice place, but it's a bit like now. It's like really busy, like traffic. And you've got a 12-year-old boy, you don't want them on those roads, right? So, and again, Phuket, mafia, there's all that stuff going on. If you've got a business, you want to keep your head down rather than, especially my business where you're in the business of promoting yourself. And that all goes on in Phuket. I didn't want that. So we had the conversation and said, remember when last time we flew to Phuket, we stopped at Singapore for 2 days on the way, which we did with the family. I said, what did you think of Singapore? And my wife was like, I love it. And my son was like, yeah, I love it. Because at the time he was really into Uber.
Yeah.
that sold him on Singapore, not like anything else. But he just liked the idea of Uber because he could get this app and call a car. He loved that. I said, well, what about Singapore? And they're like, okay, what does it mean? I said, well, I've done my research and I think we could get a work permit. I can get a work permit here if I do this, that, and the other. But it's a risk. I could take a huge risk. I can't do this semi-retired. It's expensive. I need to go in and I need to invest this money and all that kind of thing. So it was like the do or die moment, which was, and I realized, I was in Thailand. I could spend the next 30, 40 years, we could spend the next 30, 40 years of our lives just kind of living this semi-retired life. Or do we double down and go back and what I'm really passionate about, and that is entrepreneurship, and start a business properly, and starting a business over living on a paradise island. So to your point about Singapore, that's why I'm here. And I don't know. I mean, I often think about it, and in the shower in the morning or lying in bed at night, I also think, like, was that the right thing to do? Because I could have had it easy, but here, it's there's a struggle, there's a hustle every single day. A hustle, stressful, but that was by choice.
Yeah. So you had a choice of paradise or
struggle. Yeah, give me the struggle every single day.
So do you think that's a core part of you? Is that something that's in you that if it's too easy, you're looking for the challenges? Is that weird?
I think that's what I don't know. I mean, we talked about this like on The Grind when we did that podcast, and we kind of discover a lot about ourselves which you don't realize. And I think, we're hardwired as entrepreneurs a little bit differently, especially if you've traveled, stepped outside your comfort zone. So yeah, maybe I think it's not masochist, but we're more turned on by struggle and overcoming than we are by lying on a beach. Don't get me wrong, I love lying on the beach, but in terms of what makes me happy, and especially what makes my family happy, is the sense of doing something. So, and I don't know, so like we're all sort of searching for happiness, aren't we, in our life? That's sort of our eternal quest, and we're looking around, looking under things for answers, turning over stones for these sort of philosophical answers. And I think it just comes down to, it's not, happiness is not a state. It's not something you get. It's not something you win. It's not something you achieve. Happiness is doing. Yeah. I mean, so if playing volleyball makes you happy, just set up a life where you can do more of that. Or if walking makes you happy, how do you create a life where you can do more of that? Or if eating food makes you happy, or traveling places, it's not like, how do I get to this point? It's like, how do I stay in the game longer doing that? So I guess for me, happiness is just doing what makes me happy, and what makes me happy is just making stuff and challenge.
So you said you never left the entrepreneur world behind. So how did you decide what you were going to do with the entrepreneur world? So you're making podcasts. You've started asiatechpodcast. You're in Singapore now. Why not just have a small podcast that you just trundle along with, just interview entrepreneurs on a sort of an individual basis? Why not just do that?
Because I committed. So
And what does that commitment mean for you?
Well, there's financial commitment.
Yeah.
But I guess it's you're committed. You're taking a path, and in a way, you've burnt your bridges as well. There's no going back. So, I'm absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I enjoy the risk of doing it as well. The fact that it isn't trundling along is, and the fact that it carries a risk, and the fact that it does have a cost, excites me. Because it really, I don't know, it's like, why, it's going back to like an Ironman. Why the fuck would you do such a stupid race? It doesn't make sense. Like, nobody enjoys it, like doing the race. It's painful, it's hard, you get sad, go into all kinds of dark places during the race, and you didn't realise, actually, I'm paying to do this. So, yeah, I think that's the answer. I can't remember what the question was.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is that you could have just had Asiatech podcast as a weekly podcast,
right,
that you interviewed entrepreneurs. I mean, similar to what I do, on a weekly basis, just interview, edit, upload it, and just keep repeating that. But you've taken on a sort of a leadership role in the podcasting industry, whereby you're getting other podcasters, you're pulling other podcasters in to say, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? How can we take this forward in Asia? So why have you, this is what I'm trying to get, why are you doing that?
I like a challenge.
Yeah.
But it reminds me back in the day when I was selling youth mobile research. Like, everybody disbelieved me. And I like that. I like proving motherfuckers wrong. I think a lot of people, and I guess there's a serious point, is that, and I'm sure you could unpack the psychology on a deeper episode, put me on the couch. But I think that, like, what motivates entrepreneurs, a lot of people talk about the opportunity, changing the world and making the world a better place. And I wonder, there's a whole lot out there who've just got to prove people wrong, rightly or wrongly, that, it's like, I think great things come out of positions of pain, like whatever happened in your life, or whatever those kind of layers of personality that were formed when you were a kid, right? And you think about, anybody who's done anything amazing in art or music, for example, they've had a pretty fucked up childhood, right? They just create, they have so much to bring. They have the most beautiful voices come from those positions of pain. I'm not saying I'm like that, but I'm saying that sometimes that can be an amazing motivator, that you just feel that this has to be done because those voices are there. You remember those people saying those things to you, right? And that's what you want to prove wrong. You don't want to, I'm being honest, I'm not interested in changing the world. If I make the world a better place, that's a bonus, right? But, when you grow up and, you're told a certain thing about yourself, or people tell you that you have to be like this, or that never goes away. That I don't know, as a teenager, that's there forever. It's embedded in your soul, right? So it's just like, this is this, but turned into something very positive. Because I think that could eat you up as a kid, right? Those kind of angers that you have when you're a teenager, and you're fighting.
So is it the business you want to create, or is it a podcast business you want to create, or is it a media business you want? What do you want to create? Where do you see yourself in? Where do you see Asiatech Podcast in 10 years or 5 years?
I want to do. I mean, I came to Singapore, and I've told people this before if they've heard my story, is that I want to create the MTV of the startup ecosystem, and I love MTV. Because I grew up with MTV. For me, it represents something, and they're also one of my best clients, as I said earlier. Yeah. But that's no coincidence, right? Sorry, it is a coincidence, but maybe it isn't. It's part of the whole story, right? And for me, they changed everything, and not just for me, but in music as well. Like, if you were a black musician in America in the 80s, like, you didn't stand a fucking chance. Like, if you were Michael Jackson, like, you didn't get any airplay. And it wasn't just Michael Jackson, it was all those sort of hip hop artists that were just getting nothing. You know, if you were like a white country player, then maybe you got some airtime, or white rock and roll or whatever. But there was a whole generation of people who didn't get any airtime. They didn't have a voice, they didn't have a channel, but they had amazing music and amazing stories to tell. And MTV came along, and it happened at the time of Betamax video and cheap TV and $50 music videos, right? And it just all happened, and they just democratized the whole thing, and they blew it up. And they just basically said, look, that era is over. Now we're going to give everybody a voice. And obviously at the time, you got to put it in context of where we were at the time. Like now it's nothing, right? It's nothing. It's like now it's YouTube and Spotify. But back then it was MTV. So I want to do that for the startup ecosystem, because I look around and I think, wow, there's so many amazing stories out there. You know, there's Jack Ma for sure, but who else do you know? And I want to do that for that generation, people who don't have a platform, who aren't getting recognized, who aren't the self-promoters. And I want to hear their stories and build that platform across Asia, because it's just amazing. Like,
so you want to, like, you said they're not the self-promoters, but with MTV,
yeah,
the musicians, the artists, they want to self-promote.
yeah.
So how do you convince an entrepreneur that's not a self-promoter to self-promote?
Yeah.
To make, or how would you do that? What would you suggest to them?
Story.
And what does that mean? Story. You know, if I've come to you, I'm an entrepreneur, I appear on your podcast.
Yeah.
And what are you telling me that I need to do?
Well, if you're here to reach out to an audience, whether it is, I mean, like on one of our shows, it's all about pitching to investors or hiring talent. It's telling a story effectively. And what you're good at, for example, is asking the right questions. You're setting me up to answer those questions. And anybody sitting here in that situation has an opportunity to tell their story, right? To do that, I think they've got to start with what is broken. So why does this all make sense? Like, why the hell should I spend an hour listening to this guy? You know, what's he trying to fix? So in terms of storytelling, always start with the problem. What's broken and how are you fixing it? And I think that's a great place to start, because they might not be a natural self-promoter. They might not be a slick pitch man or woman, but they know what's broken. So like with them, like with Asiatech Podcast, if I was sitting here and you're asking me in those contexts, I say, well, you know, startup investors, startup founders all want to raise money, all want to hire good people and tell their story, but they don't have a platform to do that. Nothing. They have databases, lists, events, shitty pitch competitions, demo days, but there's nothing. And that's got to change. So that's the problem.
So you're suggesting that they come on Asiatech Podcast and tell their story and reach their audience through you?
Well, yeah, there isn't many other alternatives. Yeah, of course, there's events and so on, but I don't want to do the sales pitch, but you're not going to get many opportunities to tell the story in your terms. I mean, like, for example, you're sitting here asking me questions in a very supportive way. You're not you're not doing the journalist angle on me. Graham, in 1993, you said this. How do you justify that? That's no good. That's not going to get people telling their story. And in the pitch competition, like, you know, we've seen these awful pitch competitions where people stand up and and then the high five and
I almost think they're like beauty competitions.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And then I always think, you know, you put like Sergey and Larry, the Google boys on that, how would they do? They'd be awful. Can you imagine they stood up and said, oh, we've got this thing and we're not very good at presenting. It's kind of like a search bar. Oh, what? What's a search bar? Well, we're going to do this to the world of information. Can you imagine? They'd be terrible. And people are like, boo, get off. Yeah. Get on the next one. Yeah, the guys didn't the high fives. So I think a lot of startup founders are like that. They're not slick pitch people, especially here in Asia. I want to give them a voice. Let's hear that story. Let's give them a chance. Let's hear it, because in this environment, it's a chance to come out.
So your story is the MTV of the entrepreneurship startup world in Asia. And that's what giving them a voice.
That's what I want to build. Yeah. It's not my story, but that's a story that I'm part of. And if we can make it happen, that would be awesome. It's a time capsule of our time and all the amazing people in it, right? Those human stories.
So if anyone wants to get on the podcast to tell their story,
what do they do? Well, I mean, if they're a startup raising funds or hiring people, go to pitchdeck.asia. That's the Pitch Deck show. That's a starting point for startups. Or if they are a podcast host, Asiatech Podcast.
Okay. So anything else you want to add?
No, you've been a really good interviewer, conversationalist, host. So? Yeah, definitely. I enjoyed that.
Okay, so if anyone, you heard the link, Asiatech Podcast.
Yeah,
I'll probably be, as I say, stealing this one and put it on my own channel.
Yeah, shout out to Asia Biz Stories.
Yeah. And get in touch with Graham. You can also get in touch with you through LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, details in the show notes. Yeah. And Neville J. McKenzie. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Graham.
Thank you.